Good evening, panelists, professors, and participants. Students for the Promotion of International Law Mumbai, in association with Informa Law UK, is pleased to welcome you to the panel discussion of the 11th Government Law College International Law Summit 2021 on the topic, an Indo-Pacific legal maritime framework of promising future or risking the balance. SPIL Mumbai is a student-run committee based in Government Law College. We host a variety of events and competitions, including webinars, the Judgment Deliberation competition, panel discussions, legal article writing competitions, amongst many others.
We request everyone to keep their mic muted and cameras off throughout the session. Moreover, all questions from the YouTube live chat will be sent to the panelists on the Zoom chat. A Google form will be circulated at the end of the meeting for the participation certificates. We request you to fill the form for the same. Without further ado, we would now like to introduce our stellar panel to the audience. Our first esteemed panelist is retired Rear Admiral Sudarshan Shrikhande, who has commanded 3 ships and has been defense attaché in Australia and to other South Pacific nations. He is the head of Naval Intelligence and Chief of Staff of South Naval Command. As a veteran, he continues teaching at several institutions, including the NDC, all law colleges, and the CDM, as well as the NDA and INA. He is also pursuing his PhD at Mumbai University in sea-based nuclear deterrence. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Our second expert panelist is Captain Sarabjeet S. Parmar, who is an alumnus of the National Defence Academy, Kharakwasla, and Defence Services Staff College, Wellington. Captain Parmar is a Sea King pilot who has commanded 2 ships in a frontline squadron. He was also a member of the 11th Indian Antarctic Expedition. He has represented the Indian Navy at the first International Horseback Conference at Norfolk, USA. He has written extensively on maritime security issues and is currently the Executive Director of the National Maritime Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir.
Our next esteemed panelist for the panel discussion is Professor James Kraska, who is the Chair and Charles H. Stockton Professor of International Maritime Law at the U.S. Naval War College. He is also a visiting professor of law and John Harvey Gregory Lecturer on World Organization at Harvard School of Law. Apart from this, he is also a distinguished fellow at the Law of the Sea Institute, University of California, Berkeley School of Law. He has also authored numerous scholarly articles and books, including Maritime Power and the Law of Sea and The Free Sea, the American Fight for Freedom of Navigation. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Our fourth expert for today is Ms. Pooja Bhatt, who is an assistant professor at the Rashtriya Raksha University in Gujarat. She is a UGC Senior Research Fellow in Defense and Strategic Studies and a research associate at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi. She conducts guest lectures at Delhi University and Amity University on maritime security-related issues and has published several articles in journals, online platforms, as well as leading newspapers such as The Hindu and The Print. Thank you so much for joining us today, ma'am.
Lastly, we have the knowledgeable Mr. Kashish Parpiani, who is fellow at Observer Research Foundation, Mumbai Center. He has pursued BMM Journalism, MSc International Relations, and MA in United States Foreign Policy. Apart from publishing at the Institute for National Securities, Israel, the Center for Asia and Globalization, Singapore, he has been quoted in media platforms such as the Wall Street Journal, South China Morning Post, Bloomberg, Time Magazine, and Al Jazeera, to name a few. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Joining our esteemed panelists today will be none other than our beloved mentor, Professor Kishu Daswani, who will be moderating today's panel discussion. Professor Daswani has been teaching law at Government Law College, Mumbai for over 25 years. Moreover, he is a teacher at the Masters in Public Policy program, Human Rights, and Business Law at the St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. In the past, he has taught at the University of Navarra in Pamplona, Spain, and has conducted lectures at the Maharashtra Judicial Academy in Uttan, Mumbai, and at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. He also teaches international and humanitarian law at the Rotary Peace Centre in Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand. Professor Daswani is a Global Peace Index ambassador and also a resource person for the Harvard College Also has been a resource person for the Harvard College in Asia program and has conducted several workshops with national and international participants on peace and conflict resolution. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir.
We would now like to invite Professor Daswani to begin the panel discussion, give his opening remarks, and invite the panelists to make their presentations.
Thank you.
Good evening to all the panelists. Good morning, Professor Kraska. Thank you so much for joining us at this early hour. Hopefully it's summer, so the weather is keeping you in good spirits. I hope. Thank you. You just heard I'm a professor, so, I'm going to do what professors do best. They start the lecture with a PPT. So, having said that, I'm going to introduce you to the Indo-Pacific region. And as you can see, this region is the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean connected, starting from Africa, that's the eastern coast of Africa, to the western coast of the United States. It contains two of the most populous countries of the world. And while it is called the Indo-Pacific, we must realize that it's the countries that really determine the geopolitics of the area. And it has got the world's most crucial sea routes with 3 of the 4 most important choke points of the world. And you can see down from the Straits of Malacca to the Red Sea, the Suez Canal and the Straits of Hormuz. 2/3 of the world's oil supply and 1/3 of the world's bulk cargo passes through the Indo-Pacific. And it would be fair to say that it has replaced the Atlantic as the globe's busiest and strategic significant trade corridors. Now, there are several countries engaged in this, in the Indo-Pacific, key among them being Japan, Australia, India, China, and the United States. Now, for a region that is so complex, and when I say complex, just look at the geography of the countries. That's a very, very complex geography. And what really makes it worse is that most of these countries have a complicated history, with their neighbors and their distant neighbors as well. For a region like this, there's a necessity for a common rule-based order, which respects sovereignty, territorial integrity, and equality of all nations, irrespective of their size and strength. Nations that make international commitments on the use of the common spaces on sea and air, on the freedom of navigation and cooperation must uphold them. Nations should engage in a peaceful settlement of dialogue and resolve disputes by abiding to international law. But what we see here, and I take you from the top right-hand corner of my screen, and we see I don't know whether my cursor is visible, and we see there's a dispute that has been raging for many years between North and South Korea and generally the rest of the Western world. We have the Senkaku Islands, which are in dispute between China and Japan. We have Taiwan, which is being threatened by unification by China, given that democracy is dying a slow death in Hong Kong, and maybe that is the trigger for certain movements in Taiwan. We can see the South China Sea, which has been claimed as a sovereign territory of China, much to the chagrin of Vietnam, Philippines. As we come down to the archipelago of Indonesia and Malaysia, and we know that this is a ripe place, and I mean, thousands of islands there is a ripe place for terrorism, smuggling, child labor. We move slightly to the west and we come to India, in which China has set up ports in Burma, in Sri Lanka, and the Gwadar port in Pakistan for the China-Pakistan economic corridor, thereby stringing India and kind of affecting its navy strategically. India does have its own few issues in the Pork Straits and possibly the Sir Creek area with Pakistan. Moving a little further to the west, we come to the Straits of Hormuz, and we know the conflict between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. Dropping a bit further down, and we have the segment that sees one of the major piracies in the world. So this is a very, very interesting region, and it does require regulation. But the real politic on the ground we see is a kind of resurgence of the Brezhnev doctrine, where nations, a powerful nation exerts extraterritorial influence over its less powerful neighbors. Over the years, we've seen many initiatives, a good bit of them led by Japan, Australia, the United States. That's the free and open seas of the Indo-Pacific. We have a fantastic initiative that really promises to bind the Indo-Pacific together for the greater good of humankind, which is called the Belt and Road Initiative. Say the BRI of China, we have the Look East policy from India, we have the quadrilateral dialogue of security and cooperation by India, Japan, Australia, and USA. Now, in this quagmire of how do we look forward to the Indo-Pacific over the next decade or two, I call on the panelists to give their opinions, views, and opening comments. Thank you. Could I call on the Rear Admiral Shrikhande to start the proceedings?
Professor Daswani, and I thank the organizers for the invitation to speak this evening in the company of distinguished subject matter experts and professors of law. And as you've said, in a lovely spring morning for Dr. James Kraska at Newport. The discussion is, of course, under the patronage of an aptly named Society for the Promotion of International Law. And I say this as a sailor, firstly, as an erstwhile Navy user and at times enforcer of international maritime law, and as a teacher of strategy and operation. I can vouch for the benefits of the age-old principles of the freedom of the sea. A sailor also needs to understand the fundamental principles governing the codification of the laws of the sea, also understand the nuances and challenges of its applications, which are going to grow in complexity in time to come. There will be more nuances and more complications. Second, as this audience of senior advocates and law students understands only too well, interpreting the law in all its complexity through the centuries of old case files of what has happened or what was prevented from happening at sea and relate to incidents and circumstances of our own times and in decades to come is important. Third, I see a synonymous relationship between the words promotion, in the name of your society, and advocacy itself. This is important because you will be advocates or someday sitting in judgment of what advocates will present to you for your decision. Fourth, because we remain students always, especially under the reality of sort of wind and wave, storm and tempest, fire and foe at sea, it brings uncertainty under which navies and coast guards, among other users of the sea, including almost 100,000 merchant ships, need to protect, preserve, and promote their nation's interests. This is never easy and often not very clear on the courses of action, courses of inaction, or even of the law itself. Third, a point that may seem obvious for an audience centered on a port city like Mumbai, where perhaps many of you are currently located, perhaps less so in the hinterland, is that India's 1.3 billion citizens and global citizens are far more dependent on the freedom to use the seas than may be readily apparent. The related point is that it is no coincidence that the Indian Navy's first strategy document in 2006 was titled The Freedom to Use the Seas. A few follow-on points that come from these words are what I would suggest to you. First, this relates to the emphasis in recent years for the idea of freedom of navigation as a global guiding principle. Second, it leads to the politico-diplomatic push of the notion of the freedom of the Indo-Pacific, Professor Daswani mentioned, and that then leads to some instruments like the quadrilateral security dialogue or the Quad, and perhaps a future Quad Plus, and of course the ASEAN formulation of the freedom of the Indo-Pacific. Third, it leads us to one of the most serious matters of international maritime law. What China is doing in the South China Sea and East China Sea with its inflated claims, violations of UNCLOS, trashing of decisions of the International Court, interpretation of historical waters, etc. Fourth, China is becoming a global maritime power at a rate not really seen any time earlier in human history. It is building up its navy and multi-dimensional sea power at a rate that is astounding. Its Maritime power now spans shipbuilding, ship ownership, global port ownership, and control, insurance, crewing, etc. It also has an Indo-Pacific fishing fleet that is now more of a maritime militia than one for putting seafood on Chinese dining tables. Fifth, as we in India see with more clarity than quite a few other countries, China does not show much inclination to adhere to a rules-based order. India professes a policy to do so. Sixth, China also shows an inclination for the adage, well known amongst navies, broadly applicable to statecraft and international relations. And that adage can be worded like this, which you might have heard, that those who rule the waves can more easily waive the rules. Therefore, my final brief points. UNCLOS 1982 was born of historical understanding of the freedom of the seas. We understood this even during the Chola Empire in the early centuries of the second millennium. UNCLOS 3 developed through a common law and is as equitable, well-intentioned as an international convention can be. The seas and space, as well as cyber, are part of the global commons, based upon historical acceptance of common law and modified contextually in the service of humanity. Indian domestic law, the Maritime Zones of India Act 1976, which preceded UNCLOS, but is at variance with it on a few small aspects. Similarly, as the recent little press release by the US Navy regarding freedom of navigation ops by USS John Paul Jones showed, such things can create a small storm that could have been avoided in the first place. It also shows that our own laws and stand on freedoms available in the EEZ are at variance with international maritime law. We could discuss these aspects later. The laws of the sea are linked to the laws of armed conflict, and even within the fundamentally violent business of war, or as it is semantically called, conflict or hostilities, police action, etc., because war as such is itself sort of ruled out, is proscribed in human affairs. These aspects are important. Finally, maritime services of a nation are charged with maintaining good order at sea. Sometimes doing so may take them into gray zones of interpreting the letter of the law with the spirit of good order, not only for national, but for international maritime security. Anti-piracy, counter-terrorism, and anti-narcotic operations are necessary, even if sometimes they may push some aspects of law that may seem violations, even if only at first blush. For sailors charged with protection of interests, never easy. Decisions may be required by the man on the spot, captain of the ship, and that is why the captain of a ship is given so much authority, and he ought to therefore receive a lot more support for being the man on the spot or the woman on the spot on the bridge of a ship on that national duty. It is often a gray zone in which they operate. And as two recent cases show, one of INS Suvarna capturing a Pakistani boat with nearly 300 kilograms of narcotics, and the second of the Canadian naval ship Calgary hauling in a record of 1,276 kilograms of heroin off Oman, just as reported just this morning. It is perhaps better sometimes to have gone beyond the law than have the drugs land in some country and destroy a generation of young people, or indeed, as it happened, if terrorists land in Mumbai again from Pakistan and kill scores, as they did on 26 November 2008. Enforcing the laws of the sea, preserving good order, doing our part to encourage others to adhere to a rules-based international order are something that navies and coast guards do on their own and in cooperation with other navies. In time to come, overcome some of the risks to the freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific, I think this will have to increase because I see some dark clouds ahead. And I would suggest to the SPIL that it is a great way to keep and even promote peace itself. Thank you. And I turn over the floor, I think, to Dr. Kraska, whose works and deep insights I have always admired. Thank you.
Thank you, Shrikhande. That was lovely framework on where we're going to move this discussion forward, in terms of you emphasizing how India would adhere to the rule of law and how we do have maverick nations who would not, adhere to the rule of law. I also liked very much how you said that we must follow the law in the letter or spirit, depending on the condition. And you gave us a very good practical implication of the nuances that a seafaring captain might face. Thank you so much. Professor Kraska.
Thank you kindly, Professor Daswani, and thank you also to SPIL, Government Law College of Mumbai. It's always an honor to talk to the oldest law school in Asia. I first went to GLC in 2016, and I'm very pleased to continue the collaboration and the partnership today. Also, it's wonderful to see very brilliant colleagues, influential colleagues, and share the panel with you. My view is that the maritime legal order in the Indo-Pacific region is a subset of the global legal order. And the global legal order since the end of World War II has somewhat been dominated by or led by the United States and dominated by the idea of a free and open exchange led by democracies with human rights and fundamental freedoms of the individual at the core of our approach to global governance. This also includes economic freedom and the attempt to adopt the UN Charter and the rule of law reflected in the UN Charter as a reflection of law in our domestic societies, in our national societies, and to take this rule of law and put it on the global level for global governance. This effort has been resisted first principally by Russia, and now of course by China and some other number of smaller countries that are enabled by Russia and China, principally North Korea, Iran, Pakistan. And these states have had a corrosive effect on this project to build a proper global legal order. Now, don't get me wrong, no country is perfect, certainly not the United States, not India, but nonetheless, we are striving to be governed by the rule of law and to apply those principles to global governance. And that's very different from the detractors, principally in Russia and China. With regard to China, my view is that the United States and the West helped to create and enable the Chinese miracle. With Russia, we resisted, and through that resistance, we were able to divert Russia from a Cold War, and Russia is still a problem, but much less powerful than it was. With China, my view is that we took the wrong approach. We aspired for China to be more like us, and we hoped that China would become a liberal and open system that would have that same impact in global governance. But the problem is that China, as it grew stronger, it became less liberal and more coercive. And so this project in social development between the West and China really has failed because it has not lived up to our aspirations. And of course, everybody's familiar with China's disregard for international law and the rule of law, because I would suggest that it has no regard for the rule of law at home. And this is why we have experienced intellectual property theft, relentless cyber attacks, coercion by China to its neighbors. All of these things have gotten worse as China has gotten stronger. And my view is because we've continued to follow a policy that seeks to strengthen and bolster China when it became evident some time ago, in my view, at least 10, if not 20 years ago, that this was only enabling a bad actor. So that brings us to where we are today. And my view is that the democracies, and principally the Quad states that were mentioned, the United States, Japan, India and Australia, provide the best antidote or counterweight to China's malign influence. And my view is that we ought to start and invest all those aspirations that we had with China that somewhat went off the rails, and we ought to turn and put those investments instead toward India. So what am I talking about? Preferential access to markets. China can list stocks on the American Stock Exchange that do not meet the transparency requirements that even US stocks have. China has had special dispensations in world bodies, including the World Trade Organization. India was a founding member of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the predecessor to the World Trade Organization. We let China into the WTO in 2001, and it has followed a mercantilist policy rather than an open and free trading system. Also, I would put in this category not just increasing the Quad and strengthening relationships among these states, but advocating for India to take its place as a global power, such as a seat on the UN Security Council, which I believe the United States, France, and the United Kingdom should advocate for. All of these things would help to raise India into its proper place to ensure that there's global stability and that China is not a dominant force in East Asia. A strong India is the key to an Asian regional legal order, and indeed, perhaps to a strong stable global order. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kraska, for that nice little summary of what we did with China over the years and why the Western nations would definitely prefer to associate with India because of having common interests in terms of democracy and rule of law and a shared value system. I would now ask Captain Parmar.
Thank you, Professor Daswani. And many thanks to the organizers for this. It's a great panel discussion, and a lot of issues are coming out on the table. And I think you've got a great panel going. I know, in fact, Admiral Shrikhande and I have served together, and it's always a pleasure discussing maritime legal issues with him and, of course, Professor Kraska. James and I go back a long time. We still do dueling once in a while, but we depart as friends, and that's the way I think the India and US should look at the future. And Pooja, good to see you. And Kashish, we will meet up here. So what I'm going to do is, since the broad brush has been set up, I'm going to look at the specifics of maritime. And the term itself, maritime legal, is something that I would say that we should not look at, because in any case, when you look at UNCLOS, it's supposed to be a gentleman's agreement, because one is there is no enforcement mechanism. One, it is based on the issue that nations who have ratified or even who have just signed, and as per the Vienna Convention of Laws and Treaties, will abide by a letter and spirit which has been said so. But here there lies a problem, is that interpretations come in the way, and that has been from day one. And at NMF, we are very fortunate that we have the full 17 volumes of the UNCLOS record of discussions, which has been gifted to us by the late Rear Admiral O.P. Sharma. We lost him a couple of months back. He was the last surviving member of all of the Indian delegation who represented India in all UNCLOS meetings. Another very fine storehouse of knowledge we have lost, and I've learned a lot from him. And every time I read the record of discussions, it's enlightenment. It's a hallelujah for me. Because when you see the method in which the groups that were formed during the discussions of UNCLOS, and remember, this Cold War was on at that point in time. It's behind us, but there are still some pointers that sorely stick out, and that's where the differences in opinion come. Where you had the Western-led bloc, and you had NATO and US, and then you had the Soviet-led bloc. And then you had those little nations in between, like India, who said, all right, we are at that point in time non-alignment, and of course now strategic autonomy. And therefore, most of the nations who voiced opinions against the issues which I'm going to discuss were those who got independence after World War II. So there's a legacy of colonization, there's a legacy of an issue of sovereignty. There is, I would say, a feeling that if we let foreign warships into our waters, you're asking for trouble. But there's a lot of water under the bridge, and this is what I'm going to unfold out here. So when you look at the interlocks insofar as, say, a maritime framework for Indo-Pacific goes, I think there are 5 broad aspects. One is geopolitical, which subsumes geostrategic. The environment has changed today, and I'll come to that a little bit. Then there's jurisdictional issues. Is that what is mine, but it's not yours. And therefore, the issue of protection and conservation of maritime environment comes about. And today, when we look at blue economy, we're looking at balancing what you call benefits of mankind vis-a-vis the health of ocean resources, and therefore we're looking at a sustained exploitation. And this is where issues like IUU fishing and all those other issues come in, which are a part and parcel of what UNCLOS is threatened by. And then, of course, you have under the overall broad umbrella of traditional security issues, which were covered by Professor Daswani with the slide, and thank you for that, are those little pockets of non-traditional security issues. But the main issue is it always only maritime zones? Is UNCLOS only maritime zones? I would tend to disagree. UNCLOS, if we go into the basis of it, was based on sovereignty. And if you look at para 4 of the preamble, very clearly it says is with due regard to the sovereignty of all states. So therefore, UNCLOS will apply to only those instances or issues where sovereignty is internationally recognized. Unfortunately, in the South China Sea, sovereignty is an issue. So that is why we are seeing all the problems we see. And you can magnify that or you can reduce it, but you can place it on any other issues where you have islands under dispute. And one example, I would say the Kuril Islands between, say, Russia and Japan is one. And there are many other islands like this, which slowly, of course, has been there. And there are enough International Court of Justice rulings that say that the accepted principle of international law is that sovereignty over land is the basis for determining maritime rights. And I think it's based on this sort of a statement that China said when Philippines took it to the international arbitration that, listen, we don't recognize this court. It's not maritime zone, it's sovereignty. And that's why it changed its tack to the 4 shark claims, but a little bit about that. So therefore, your maritime disputes and everything else which is related to it, whether it's resources, whether it is issues of freedom of navigation, whether it is an issue of FONOPS, will continue until the issue of sovereignty over lands and islands is not settled. And one issue I'd like to bring out here is that when you look at Article 121, regime of rocks and islands, there are 2 either criteria that has to be satisfied if an island or if a rock is to be recognized an island and it qualifies for all maritime zones, that is habitability or economics of economic worth. Now, the ruling in the Philippines case that says none of these are rocks and islands, to my mind, is a judgment case, because hereinafter, it will actually destroy all claims made by many other nations asking for rocks and islands to become islands. For example, Ituaba, which is occupied by Taiwan, I think since even before early 70s or late 1960s, and Taiwan says 1950s, is the only island which has got a natural source of water. But now it no longer qualifies as an island. So even if Taiwan was recognized as a state in the dispute, this arbitration, the judgment has put rest to that totally. Do remember also Malaysia in the initial years around 91, 92, also tried to build a hotel on an island so that it would have economic value. So there are nations who play the interpretations to their game, and that is what I'm coming at. And another issue that we need to look at is the impact of rising sea levels. We say this. What happens to the baselines? And the baselines is another major issue where the interpretations flow all over the place. For example, when you look at the US Judge Advocate General website, they got lovely maps. They have drawn the baselines. They have it for India. They have it for Japan. On the right top corner, there's a small box that says that we don't recognize these baselines. They do it for Japan also. So it's an interpretation view. And when you look at the map of India, well, we do have a slight problem there that when we deposited our coordinates for baselines, we didn't deposit for the eastern coastline of Andaman Nicobar Islands, but that's a story unto itself. We can discuss that during questions. And then, of course, there is the question of historical claims, the question of innocent passage, and of course, EZ. Now, Admiral Shrikhande mentioned about when the conference was called for. And I would take you back to UN Resolution 2750, I think, Charlie, dated 17 December 1970, where it was decided to convene a conference of 73. Basically, 5 main issues: establishment of an equitable international regime. Have we reached that? Question mark. A precise definition of the area. Now, area is your part 11 of UNCLOS, which itself is a separate document, and I'll come to that. And that area definition is the subsoil, ocean floor, and seabed beyond national jurisdiction. So this is where now the debate of BVNG and AVNG is coming about, and it's gathering focus because seabed mining is another issue. It's an unexplored area. We do not know the ramifications of seabed mining to the marine resources. And then ISB has coming out with certain regulations and all. But then again, if it's going to be like UNCLOS, it's going to be a gentleman's handshake. And then there are a broad range of related issues to the regimes of the high seas. We know the difference in opinion between military activities in EZ. The US says that freedom of high seas is applicable in the EZ, but there are many other nations who disagree. Then the fourth point was fishing and conservation of living resources of the high seas, which was one main issue why UNCLOS was called for, because nations started realizing that their resources are being taken away from them. And last but not the least is preservation of marine environment. So when we look at UNCLOS, I would implore students to look at three main documents. We only talk of UNCLOS, but there are two more. One is the agreement relating to the implementation of Part 11 of the Convention, which I have mentioned, which is the area, and the implementation of the provision of the Convention relating to the conservation and management of straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks, fishing resources. Let's keep it short at that. But the beauty of it is 14 nations have signed but not ratified UNCLOS. And insofar as Indo-Pacific is concerned, Cambodia, Iran, and the UAE have signed but not ratified UNCLOS. So how do you get them in the debate if you want to? Number two is there are 16 nations who have neither signed nor ratified, and 9 are landlocked. So when you look at the coastal states, the one that stands out is, of course, Eritrea. Israel, like it or not, Israel by definition is an Indian Ocean region nation because it's got a port that opens out east of Suez Canal. But then Israel has neither signed nor ratified, and neither has the US. The only document that the US has signed is the agreement relating to the implementation of Part 11 of the Convention, but it is not ratified. Interestingly, Iran has signed and ratified the fishing stock agreement. So you see how nations look at their various options and their interpretations in their best interest. And I always say that nations will interpret international laws and conventions based on their national interest. So we have a sort of an intergrid law. We've got a little battle going on between national laws versus UNCLOS. Admiral Shrikhande mentioned the MZ Act of 1976. I'll come back to a little later. And then, of course, there is the issue of innocent passage. But insofar as India is concerned, in the MZ Act of 1976, it predates UNCLOS by 6 years. And Admiral O.P. Sharma told me this, that when MZI Act was being drafted, a lot of issues were discussed, and this came out in almost alignment framework with territorial seas. What we added was foreign warships, including submarines and other underwater vehicles, may enter or pass through the territorial waters after giving prior notification. Interestingly, in one of the initial discussions, it was approval, but it got changed to notification. Otherwise, we would have had a bigger problem on our hand. And then we understand the provisions do not authorize other states to carry out military activities in these. This is a statement we deposited when we ratified UNCLOS. And many other nations, there are up to around 66 odd nations who have deposited statements on their interpretation of certain specific articles. I think last was Algeria around 1 or 2 years ago, but not germane to Indo-Pacific per se. So then you have Myanmar, who says that foreign warships need to obtain permission. And this is as per the Territorial Sea and Sea Zones Law of 2017. They just updated the 2013 law. You have the Republic of Korea, foreign warships or non-commercial government ships to provide 3 days prior notification for innocent passage. And yes, of course, North Korea has neither signed nor ratified UNCLOS or any of the documents. So you may like to put him off as a bad boy, has been discussed. Bangladesh says the prior notification of the exercise of the right of innocent passage of warships is reasonable and not incompatible with UNCLOS. So what I'm getting out here is that a lot of nations have deposited their statements, their interpretations. But let's pause. That was 40 years ago. 2022 is 40 years of UNCLOS. Where have we reached? We can have a relook and reevaluation of where do we stand. There are a lot of things, a lot of water under the bridge. Let's forget it when we made Buddha smile the second time and the US is very unhappy. And then, of course, doors were closing on India all over the place. Today, we have signed, I think, a number of treaties or understandings which are in consensus with maritime security and many other issues in the last 2-3 years. We have our interpretations, but you need to put them aside for the better good of a sort of a maritime framework for the Indo-Pacific, which is based on the rules-based order. But the question often asked is whose rules? So we may not be happy with US all the time, but we're great friends. So you overlook certain issues. And to my mind, the proclamation by the US PACOM, and I think James and I have the same views on this, I think we did a little exchange on Twitter, is that do it, but don't make it public. If you look at all the FONOPS reports of the US, which are available online dating back to 1991, India finds mention in all years except a couple of them. So what does it matter? First of all, do you have the capacity and capability to tell the US to stay outside? The US or the Department of Defense, this is an annual report to the Congress. Therefore, they are, by legislation, they are to do it. And this started in 1979 when the Carter administration came in and reinforced by Reagan. But the sensitivity of nations and understandings of their various interpretations must be taken into account. Today, the US and Vietnam are great friends. Could you have imagined that back in the late 1970s? You couldn't have. So put aside these differences, there is a reason to do it. And when you look at China, since China has been mentioned, I know it's always the elephant in the room. So China reaffirms its sovereignty over all its archipelagos and islands listed in Article 2 of the law of the PRC on Territorial Sea and Contiguous Zone, promulgated 1992. When you look at the baseline coordinates which have been deposited by China, it goes to a certain lat long, and then it says the rest will be intimated later. We will see when the later comes. So this is where we stand. So if there is going to be a difference in opinion, we need to look at the better good as to what is it that is important, say, for a maritime framework for Indo-Pacific. What is it that we need to do? Today, the Quad is coming to focus. Does it mean that we agree with whatever US, Australia, or Japan say? Japan also, remember, has FONOPS carried out by the US against it, because it does not recognize the baseline methodology adopted by Japan. But yet the US has got bases in ports in Japan. So to my mind, sometimes it defies logic, is that you got bases operating from ports inside baselines which you don't agree upon, but yet they operate together and they are great allies. So that is the way international relations go, and that is the way I think we need to look at various other issues. Then, of course, we got a lot of these nations now coming in. France is now is a part and parcel of both IONS and IORA, and France is going to be chair of the EU next year presidency. I think it takes over. It is going to steer IONS. It is going to steer IORA. Therefore, if France is an Indo-Pacific nation, maybe that's another nation we need to look at in the methodology it expresses in the Indo-Pacific. Germany is, again, says the delineation is not very clear geographically, and the Indo-Pacific debate is a separate one. I will leave it for the question and answers. And sorry, but then you must remember where China stands. So when China, and this is my closing remarks here. So when China turned from maritime zones to the Fosha claim and claimed sovereignty over 4 island groups, that is Pratas, Paracel, Spratly, and Macclesfield Bank, the Minister of National Defense of China in the Shangri-La Dialogue on 2nd June 2019 defended the arming and the reclaiming of islands in the statement. He says it is the legitimate rights of a sovereign state to carry out construction on its own territory, sovereignty. China built limited defense facilities on the islands and reefs for self-defense, the right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. It is only when there are threats will there be defenses in the face of heavily armed warships and military aircraft, FONOPS carried about by many nations. How can we not deploy any defense facilities? So this is the rhetoric which China puts forward. We may not agree with it, but that is the rhetoric it puts forward. And he also said at the end, we hold different views with the US side on several issues regarding the wrong words and actions of the US on Taiwan and South China Sea. We express our firm opposition. So nations will continuously interpret international law and convention, put out these statements in the open. But if you need to have a maritime framework for the Indo-Pacific, it needs like-minded nations. And James, I disagree with you here, not only democracy, but like-minded nations. Let's get Vietnam into the group. Because do remember, Vietnam is one nation who's taken on the 4 powers and come out, well, did well, I think. It's taken on the US, France, it's taken on China, it's even stood up to Russia at some point in time. So we need to look at like-minded nations. And having said that, I'll pause. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Captain Parmar. That was a broadside barrage on the nuances of UNCLOS and a variety of interesting data that I'm sure the students would have loved to hear those interesting little facts that you brought on the table. Thank you so much. I would like to now move to Pooja.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor Kraska there. A lot of things have been already discussed and in detail, of course. So I don't think I'll be guilty of repeating a lot of those points. However, knowing the fact that we are now talking to international law students, I have actually tried to keep my presentation in three parts. First of all, what I feel about Indo-Pacific and how the students of international law and international studies should see the entire concept as. First part. Second part would be what are the issues with the international maritime legal framework at the moment. Many of them have been already discussed by the superior panel before me, and I'll be again repeating on some of the points. Third being, what can, as the students and scholars of international law, what can we do about it? So these would be three part of the presentation. So the construct of Indo-Pacific itself started as a very amorphous identity, very loosely defined concept. Actually, it did mean different things to different people from different countries. Over the years, there has been a deliberate attempt to give it a shape by taking on purpose, by providing it a security construct by both the resident countries of the Indo-Pacific as well as those countries that have the stakeholder effect in the region. This construct of Indo-Pacific was fostered by the recognition for the continued promotion of trade through unhindered and uninterrupted sea lines of communication, upholding maritime connectivity, maritime development, and use of marine resources, as well as their safety and security in the Indo-Pacific region. There also has been a recognition of cooperating on the areas of common interest, as much as addressing the mutual challenges that the countries in this region they face, both of the natural origin as well as man-made origin. So after all, Indo-Pacific does not connect the two oceans, Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean. It also connects the underdeveloped and developed economies in the Indian Ocean to the developed ones in the Pacific Ocean. So in other words, not only do we share the challenges, we also share the interest that the oceans accrue. Therefore, it is needless to say the countries of Indo-Pacific have to work together in both the cases, whether they are challenges, whether they are interests. What has complicated the maritime dimension more has been the continued threat to the security in various ways. And I'll stick to human security more because I think even before the national security, we need to talk about humans because even state security is linked to human security, and anything that impacts human security is a part of national security. So whether there are issues of drug and illegal narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, piracy that has been rampant in the region. Apart from these issues, there are sensitive issues such as rampant commercial fishing, oil and mineral exploration that are further stressing our common oceans and common heritage. Furthermore, it also impacts the food and health security, economic security of the coastal communities that are dependent on fishing and maritime trade. So in addition to that, in the mention of national security issues like nuclear and arms proliferation, competing and excessive maritime and territorial claims is another angle. So there are a lot of new issues which have added up and complicated the maritime sphere more than ever. And Indo-Pacific is one such glaring example of it. Last but not the least, the issues of illegal, unregulated IUU fishing, which has added to another dimension to the maritime security challenge to both national security as well as human security of these developing and underdeveloped countries of the Indo-Pacific. The vast stretches of water render it very difficult for only one or a few group of countries to challenge these threats. It is in this regard, do we need a maritime legal framework for Indo-Pacific region? Do we need a separate maritime legal framework? Of course, no. But what we need, international maritime scholars and lawyers, is to develop solutions and to seek answers while keeping certain things in mind. First of all, we spoke about the interpretation of UNCLOS quite in vast detail by previous speakers before me and how it is important to interpret UNCLOS. So the waters, of course, beyond the territorial waters are common to all. They're high seas, they're common sets of mankind. However, the interpretation that UNCLOS is just like another law. it presents certain challenges that every country has interpreted in different manner, and previous speakers have spoken eloquently about it and how it has impacted the security angle. So yes, issue in interpretation is one challenge that the scholars of international maritime law have to understand. A relook to it, yes. Do we need a new legal framework? Maybe no. Second issues again are the challenge between international law and municipal laws, because this is another crucial point to remember, that international laws always take precedence over domestic and municipal laws. We all, from the all the students who are studying the legal aspects know this. But we also know that in reality, this practice has not been followed by several countries in the same degree. It has been countries have definitely given preference to their domestic laws over international maritime laws. The third issue we need to think about is the implementation of international maritime law. How do we interpret it, implement it? There are issues of weak law enforcement, poor security situation due to protocols, socio-political instability within the countries. So these issues have led to commission of various offenses in the international waters, such as piracy, robbery at sea, violence, corruption, illegal fishing, smuggling, all these. So given this background, now I come to the subtitle of the talk, which is the new international legal framework, is it a promising future or risking the balance? We need to focus on this part, asking some crucial questions with respect to applying international maritime legal framework in the Indo-Pacific for strengthening peace, security, and development, and not jeopardizing it. How do we follow the rule of law collectively, where the collective regional benefits receive as much attention, if not more, than the domestic and international interests? How do we do it? Do we need new rules, new laws to foster cooperation and stability in the region? Most importantly, how do the Indo-Pacific countries cooperate with the existing international maritime laws without tipping the boat for any of the resident countries and stakeholders in states? We know China as one of them. In what ways free and open Indo-Pacific be truly inclusive of participation of countries and issues as well that impact all and not only a few countries? So there is some food for thought for scholars from my side about what we can do as scholars, and I quickly finish with this. First thing is, as we earlier speakers also stressed it enough, that we do not need to reinvent the wheel for international maritime law. We have the laws present, provided by UNCLOS. We all have this copy. All the students who are reading international maritime law, we know that UNCLOS has, anyone who has studied this Bible on the law of the seas would appreciate the vastness of the issues dealt in it, and also very comprehensively they have done it. So there is what is needed is to plug the domestic maritime laws with those with the international and regional level. This is to avoid wastage of resources. It will enhance multiplication of efforts and better coordination on maritime issues. This is where us scholars need to step in, advise and guide policymakers with our informed research and writings. Second issue which we need to think about is in how do we enhance cooperation between national and international organizations with the domestic ones. Each of the coastal countries have their domestic maritime laws on fisheries, energy, environment, transport, defense, tourism, that can be further benefited by extending and complementing with international efforts. Several of the Indo-Pacific countries are poor in resources. They don't have the proper training when it comes to maritime safety and security issues come into picture. They don't have the capacities, capability building. So that leads to multiplied and segregated effort by these countries with less than optimal results. Again, we as scholars need to find these blind spots in the international maritime and domestic legal system where we can provide workable and efficient solutions. And third point is, how do we make, this is a very crucial time to talk about Indo-Pacific policy because it's still being shaped. So how do we make it a feminist Indo-Pacific policy? And I do not mean Indo-Pacific policy has to do only with women, but what I mean that when we talk about Indo-Pacific, the talks needs to be of cooperation than confrontation, development than destruction, for creating inclusiveness than picking up sides. And therefore, the laws need to provide solutions for just equity in society and how they should be interpreted and be done so. So these are few of my thoughts for the students of international law and maritime issues, that how we need to think about these issues on Indo-Pacific and how we need to bring out solutions by thinking on these issues and creating a better resilient Indo-Pacific by providing solutions. That would be from my end. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja. That was very refreshing. You brought in soft law onto the table, and you also discussed a very important point.
Hello,
that the region is probably too big for any single institution or any single country to handle, and that's why we do need a multilateral approach, a multinational approach in this. Thank you, Pooja. Kashish.
Mm-hmm. Okay, much has already been said. So at the very outset, thank you to the SPIL community for having me today at the International Law Summit, and congratulations for going completely digital this year. It is a commendable feat. A very good evening to my respected co-panelists. I'm delighted to be here in such august company. With today's discussion centering on the prospect for a legal maritime framework in the Indo-Pacific, my position on the matter is that the Indo-Pacific is purely a strategic construct catering to the political aims of the US's rivalry with China, and hence has little or no emphasis on international law. Now, don't get me wrong, I am fully aware of the more than occasional invocations of a rules-based order steeped in international law by the US, its allied and partner nations in the broader West, and even in the Indo-Pacific region, including India. However, I'm of the opinion that they are nothing but just that. Mere rhetorical invocations. Now, allow me to illustrate my point by briefly discussing the region's record on international law, contemporary record. My co-panelists before me have already done a brilliant job on talking about China's transgressions in the region, so I'm going to quickly go over that. Just to add to Parmar's point on China's actions in the South China Sea, last year, while regional nations were combating or grappling with the coronavirus pandemic, China officiated its claims in the South China Sea by announcing administrative jurisdictions over the Paracels, the Macclesfield, and the Spratly Islands. Now let's look at the record of the US partners in the region. Consider Japan, for instance. When China in 2013 declared its air defense identification zone over the East China Sea, Tokyo's primary response was not via the legal route for the region's welfare. Instead, it sought to protect its limited interest vis-a-vis the Senkaku Islands by negotiating with the US that those contested islands also fall under the purview of the US-Japan Security Alliance. Subsequently, the Obama administration did give in to Japanese demands, and the Trump administration also practiced continuity that the Senkaku Islands fall under the ambit of Article 5 of the US-Japan Security Alliance. The other example, of course... Okay. All right. The other example is, of course, the Philippines, which has also been discussed briefly, and I'll just add to that. In 2019, the Duterte administration ignored the permanent court.
Jai Shri Ram, Jai Shri Ram.
The Duterte administration ignored the Permanent Court of Arbitration's 2016 ruling, which, by the way, was in its own favor. And instead, the Philippines sought to pursue deeper economic ties with China and a joint energy venture in the South China Sea. The one final example, of course, is India, which has also been touched upon by previous panelists. New Delhi, of course, is a party of the UNCLOS, but it does not agree with the United States' expansive interpretation of freedoms enjoyed by foreign vessels in littoral spaces. Instead, it mandates prior notification by foreign warships in its territorial waters, or EEZ, under innocent passage. This renders India's position to be closer to China's, which, by the way, mandates prior permission, as opposed to the US's stance on freedom of navigation. In the recent instance of the US's FONOP in India's EEZ, the US has called India's mandate for a prior notification onerous and excessive. So there is little agreement between India and the United States itself on what the rules of the rules-based order are. Finally, on the US's own record, apart from the fact that it remains as one of the very few remaining non-adherents to UNCLOS, Washington's actions are cloaked in calls for a rules-based order, but apparently only as long as political and strategic interests are not impacted. Now, what do I mean by that? I'll just give two quick examples and close. Consider the South China Sea again. Back in 2015, Chinese President Xi Jinping stood next to President Obama in the Rose Garden of the White House and committed not to militarize the South China Sea. Subsequently, when China did indeed renege on that commitment, the Obama administration did not hold Beijing to account, since in the closing years of the Obama years, the political priority then was to see the finalization of the Paris Climate Accords and the Iran nuclear deal, both of which warranted US cooperation with China. Subsequently, under Trump, the US increased freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea under its policy of strategic predictability and operational unpredictability. Biden commendably has practiced continuity on that by increasing FONOPs in the Taiwan Straits in the South China Sea. But the prime intention of that policy is not legal. It's again strategic and political, in the sense that the motive of that action is, of that policy, is to assert US operations as more than reactionary to Chinese moves, as a strategic and not a legal reminder of the US Navy's forward presence in the South China Sea and the other parts of the world. Similarly, consider the fact that the US speaks of an Indo-Pacific that respects and stands for nation sovereignty, but it continues to oppose the 2019 ICJ ruling, which says that the UK's control of the Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean stands in violation of the territorial integrity of Mauritius. Even the UN General Assembly in 2019 voted overwhelmingly to demand the UK to leave Chagos. That resolution was opposed by one other power, the United States. And why is that? Because the southernmost island of the Chagos, the Diego Garcia, was leased by the UK in the 1960s to the US for it to have a military base here in the Indian Ocean. So to sum it up, at the risk of being the contrarian here in the room, any invocations to international law, then to me, at least in the context of the Indo-Pacific, I'm not deriding international law at large. I am an adherent to and a believer in legal jurisprudence and multilateral fora. But in the Indo-Pacific specifically, international law then to me is just a mere window dressing for the US's bid to shore up its partnerships in the Indo-Pacific and confront China with the cumulative strength of regional nations that are agreed by Beijing for one reason or the other. So I'll end here, and I'm happy to take any questions. And once again, thank you for having me here today.
Thank you, Kashish, very much. I'm sure James is itching to answer all those questions that you've thrown at him, plus a couple of others which I'll add to it. But very interesting points you made. It almost feels like when the confrontation comes, we are ducking it. So either Japan's reaction to the ADIZ that was set above the Senkaku Islands, or so many other reactions with the A2 AD manifestations by China. There's no real confrontation with ducking, and that is probably because of the major economic power that China does throw up. In fact, I recently read an article that told me that China is influencing decisions made in Australian universities. That's the kind of soft power they are exerting across. And of course, I like your perspective on international law. In fact, one US senator said the International Court of Justice's judgments are the ones that we obey when we feel like. So that really puts an entire question into the international law that we're talking about. Now, I'm just going to run through a string of questions to all the panelists, and there are a lot of questions thrown up on the chat, which you can choose to answer probably in the second round. Just a few questions which we can answer quickly. Rear Admiral Shrikhande, can I ask a question of you, please? So, the China's BRI initiative and the Maritime Silk Route is a reality. And this is not a reality for China's strategic expansion. This is really a reality because China has got more than 1 million people working or living in Africa. 80% of their oil comes through the Indo-Pacific, and they have got a base in Djibouti now. So this is really a manifestation of their economic progress, and they're not going to step back. So how does India really deal with this reality, which cannot bend to a bundle of rules, but we just have to align and live with it, and how do we really manage? Because this is only going to increase as China's economic power. So the viewpoint here is that China's military expansion is really a product of its economic expansion. And as more and more countries lean towards China for economic dependence, how does India take this forward in the Indo-Pacific? You're on mute, sir.
I mean, it is difficult to predict how it will pan out, or what portion of the BRI might unravel. I think it's a hugely ambitious, perhaps too ambitious a project. My personal view is that by labeling it as one project, the One Belt, One Road, China has strategically disadvantaged itself, because any problem in any nation is seen as a potential problem of the BRI, for other nations also, and that's how it is going. And I think if China were to go back, they would probably do the BRI in bits and pieces without putting an entire holding company label, as they indeed have done. The BRI is a reality, no doubt about it. I agree with that. The other aspect also, I agree that China will probably require more and more military interference, military presence, military deployments to keep its BRI going. We see that happening in China. It's not unusual. Most colonial enterprises, colonial expansion required, the flag to protect the trade, including on board on land itself. So we will see more and more of that happening. What are the options for India? Well, the options for India is not to compete with the BRI, but to look for niche capabilities where we can help some of these nations with other aspects of economic development. Just because one nation is building a port, we don't have to offer another port to that same nation. There could be other areas, and I think with the Asia-Africa growth corridor, what we are doing with with Japan, what we are looking in terms of Quad, etc., might help us provide an alternative which is based on better internal laws, internal audits and jurisdiction of commercial activities within whatever alternatives we have for economic development of partner nations.
That's right. Thank you, Admiral. I think what you are saying is that the BRI lacks, a sense of transparency. It impinges on sovereignty. It's kind of a money. It's based on money, where you actually are doing a kind of a East India Company expansion into so many ports that is there. So probably we should have a soft power approach. Thank you, sir. Now, Professor Kraska, do I need to ask you some questions? You are far away from us, but in the Indo-Pacific theater, you're maybe about 10,000 miles away from home. And still you do make your presence felt there through naval bases in Guam, Okinawa, even in the South China Sea. So a declassified document I just came across, that I think the Trump administration, just before they went out, released a document, and which kind of indicated that the US position in the Indo-Pacific would be to maintain primacy in the region, of course, promote a liberal order, improve the economics of the area. So my very pointed question, along with what Kashish has thrown at you, is the US-Indo alliance, even in the Quad sphere, more out of a US-Indo alliance, or is it to keep China out of gaining primacy in the possible vacuum that they may create it?
Thank you, Dr. Daswani. Professor Daswani. It's a great question. So the fundamental tenet of American foreign policy, since it arrived on the global stage some 150 years ago, 130, 40 years ago, was to prevent the centers of power in the world, that is Asia and Europe, from falling under the sway of a hostile power. And this explains why the United States fought in World War I against Germany, in World War II, fought the Cold War, why it fought the Vietnam War, why it fought in Korea. And it explains today the US resistance to China. Now that has been the US approach for a long time. And I understand that there's sometimes latent resistance to that. No country is perfect, and including the United States, I would do some things differently. For example, I personally would reach out more to Russia, that I also view as a counterweight. It's not that I think that Vladimir Putin is a wonderful person, but you have to remember that the Allies cooperated with Stalin during World War II, and this was essential for their security as a counterweight. So I view China as the greatest threat to global peace and stability, and not necessarily concerned overly about the US position as the primary power in East Asia. I think if I were India, I would be more concerned about a vacuum if the United States left. Don't assume the United States wants to be there. The United States entered into World War I and World War II very reluctantly. We've left other conflicts, and half the country wants to focus on Make America Great Again and be done with sort of overseas intrigue. And where does that leave India, Australia, Japan, and other countries? So it's not that the United States is sort of benighted with regard to its position in the Indian Ocean. In Diego Garcia, I may be more in agreement with Kashish than he realizes. My view is that the US should take Mauritius up on their 99-year offer for a US military base at Diego Garcia. So I would support that personally. The US government has chosen not to. And that military base in Diego Garcia is the exact same military base that the US would use, in my view, if China and India ever got into a conflict. That's where the material support for India will flow, because the United States cannot afford for India to be defeated by China. And this is, this is the same reason that we resisted Imperial Japan during World War II. So I'll stop there and yield the floor to the other speakers.
Okay, so that Professor Kraska, are you getting into the foreign service? That was such a diplomatic answer. It was, it was almost perfect. But thank you. I see your point of view in terms of the US position in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you so much. There are, of course, lots of questions floating on the chat, directed at some panelists. So maybe after this round of questioning, any one of you could take them. Captain Parmar, there are a lot of questions coming on the Quad. And how exactly would the Quad help? I mean, of course, we are doing, there was a trilateral strategy, then there was a quadrilateral, there is the Operation Malabar, and India is doing a lot more activity today with a growing Navy in the Indo-Pacific. So how do you see us fitting into the Quad, and what role we will be playing to actually counter? And sad to say, I mean, the only example I can come here with is China, at this point in time.
So before I answer that, I thought I'll just add in one issue about the US signing or ratifying the main UNCLOS document. Even if the US signs, let alone ratifies it, the interpretation of UNCLOS by the US will remain as it is. So we already know the US approach. So it's not going to make any difference. And what James says, that it's a minority in Congress that is stopping it. But even if it signs, there'll be no change in the way the US operates insofar as maritime zones go. So this is a question I was asked earlier also in some other panel. That's my view. Insofar as Quad is concerned, let's look at it. The moment we say Quad, people jump to the full form of quadrilateral security dialogue. You have to go back into the history of back to say 2007, when Quad was first of all, when it came about. And I was commanding the Seeking Squadron on the carrier when we had that wonderful Malabar Exercise 02, where we had Quad plus Singapore plus UK. There was a sole Royal Naval ship. So you had 6 navies and 25 ships at sea. It's a wonderful sight, especially when you're looking at, say, maritime security At that point in time, of course, Indo-Pacific was not a big, I mean, it was just sort of under the clouds at that point in time. But we never had anything again like that. For the simple reason that I don't think the nations were ready to look at the Quad per se as a security entity. So we had Japan walking in one direction, Australia went in the other, we went in another, and it sort of dissolved. Today we're at a point where we have just about got back together. So before we look at any hard security, if that is what your question is looking at, or enforcing maritime issues out here, we need to let the Quad settle. We need to let other nations accept that Quad exists. Because when you look at, say, Southeast Asian nations, and you must remember what they all say, don't force us to take sides. And of course, they are saying that China. And if in the ASEAN Japan, I think 2018 December meeting, the Singapore Prime Minister very clearly, he said, don't ask us to take sides. You're forcing us. We will not do that. So when you look at the Quad, are you going to play it alone? Because you can't do it alone. And that's something that is, I think, all panelists will agree upon. And what Pooja said is very correct. It's too huge an area. Your area of the Indo-Ocean region, Indian Ocean region, or the Arabian Sea or Bay of Bengal sub-regions are totally different from what's happening in the South China Sea, East China Sea, or of the Pacific Islands. There is a difference in the way you have, and I would I'd recommend that people read Barry Boussin's Regional Security Complex Theory. It explains a lot as to how sub-regions work. Is that the more distant you are, the most you're a stranger to the problem in that area. So when you ask James that, the US interest in Indo-Pacific, it's very clear that they have certain interest there. But getting back to the Quad per se, so if we are to look at Quad, then the Quad should come together as like-minded nations and combat, first of all, non-traditional threats. Let's get that focus clear. Then only you'll have an acceptability of Quad being a helpful entity in the Indo-Pacific. And how can India help? When you look at, if you look at the Quad nations per se, all right, now everybody is on some sort of platform or the other. So there can be an interface, say, between IORA, East Asia Summit, Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, and Western Pacific Naval Symposium. To give an example, the moment you spread that network and people recognize, or nations recognize Quad as an entity that is meant for stability and security under the underlying theme of non-traditional threats, I think we're off to a good start. The moment you bring in the word security, nations are going to be wary of it. Now, there is this debate about Quad Plus. As far as I'm concerned, Quad Plus is an idea whose time will come. If you don't discuss it now, it will not happen. But which are the nations you take on board? We had Quad navies exercising with the French Navy in the Bay of Bengal, I think 10 days back, La Perouse. So as I said, France is one good contender you can take on board. You can take on board Southeast Asian nations. Yeah? But you need to establish Quad as an entity with a meaningful output in the Indo-Pacific. And I will say it again for the sake of repetition, that you need to focus on non-traditional threats. Do remember, 2004 tsunami, which laid the seeds of the Quad per se, is where we have reached today. So I'll pause here.
Okay. Thank you, Captain Parmar. And this leads me to my next question, which is to Pooja, in terms of non-conventional issues. So Pooja, I know your specialty is fisheries, So could you tell us something that, you would look at changing in the Indo-Pacific in a rule-based approach for IUU?
Thank you. Okay, the thing is, I have a similar question in the chat box about the IUU fishing, so I'll take it together. So what I exactly wanted to tell in my presentation also, and same has been reiterated by Captain Parmar, that non-traditional threats are the issues which need to be tackled first in Indo-Pacific before we can even, jump to traditional threat issues, because that's where we can get the kind of cooperation between the countries and the inclusiveness that we require for the Indo-Pacific region per se. So the moment we talk about US-China rivalry, South China Sea in the Indo-Pacific, we entirely change the perspective of the region. We as resident countries, we are resident scholars, we need to be a little bit wary of that particular thing of changing the entire perspective from something cooperative to competitive, and that's why I spoke about the same non-traditional threats. Coming to the question that you asked is about IUU fishing. We already have certain structures in place within the Indo-Pacific region. And we have Indian Ocean Tuna Association and others like that. The problem is all these institutions are now right now not very comprehensive and inclusive in their participation. And a lot of countries, if you see within the region, are having similar domestic laws tackling the similar issues in the region, and which is leading to, if you read these domestic laws of the different countries tackling IUU, and also what these IUU institutions are doing, like FAO and others, they have certain similarity in their objectives as well as in their action. However, because of these duplicity of efforts, we are not achieving the optimal results. So that is what we require. Currently, we have one of the issues that we can talk about is Port States Measures Act, PSMA, which again is an institution which tackles IUU fishing. However, a lot of countries within the region, Indo-Pacific, including India, is not a party to PSMA. So there are institutions which we should reach out to plug our domestic maritime laws to those international laws, so that we can work in tandem and work together, so that we avoid the wastage of resources. We get the training, the kind of financial help that we require, the capacity building we require. I think this will help in just plugging the system in a better way than duplicating our efforts. And of course, bring together the Indo-Pacific countries in a more inclusive manner.
True, I think that would definitely help, especially on the economic front. Kashish, question for you. So the middle powers in the Indo-Pacific, like probably India, Australia, Japan, do they view the US-China axis as something that would replace the Cold War axis, like USA-Russia? I mean, do we want the Indo-Pacific region to become either China or US option for the middle countries? The question would be that ASEAN countries are hugely dependent economically on China. And, given a choice, would they move in with the, as Captain Parmar said, with the Quad? Or would they compulsorily align with China because they have to? So how do you see the role of these middle countries over the next few years in the Indo-Pacific?
I think, quickly on the ASEAN, I think last year, the Yusof Institute, ICAS, does a state-of-state survey for the ASEAN and their attitudes towards international relations and pertinent issues. As per that survey, the most recent iteration of that survey, 70% of ASEAN nations would pick the US if they're forced to make a choice between US and China. But if you look at the 10 ASEAN countries in their individual responses, about 6 to 8 countries picked China, right? So it's a survey of the cumulative strategic community of ASEAN. So if you look at the cumulative figure, that of course benefits the US. But if you look at each country and their statistics, China seems to be the pragmatic option. Now on middle power.
Just a question, Kashish. Maybe I've not got this. So this survey was done with the population or with the government? Or?
No, it does an interview of the strategic community of academics, think tank professionals, former military professionals, and so on, just to get a sense of what the strategic community in a particular country is thinking and where the attitudes lie. So that's on ASEAN. On middle powers, certainly the US would want this to become a binary option between the US and China for the countries to either pick sides. The Trump administration did take many steps to ensure that they pushed regional countries or countries participating in the Indo-Pacific to make a choice between US and China. And one of the domains in which it tried to do that was in the telecom space, in the tech space. Now, with respect to Quad, for instance, if you were to consider Quad as a cohort of India and 2 other middle powers of the region, Japan and Australia, and of course, the US is an integral part of the Quad. But on the Quad, I think there is now a greater consciousness of creating an alternate vision for the region, which in a sense serves the middle powers' idea of not having to choose between US or China and having other alternatives. What do I mean by that? The Quad state level summit that happened recently concluded with an agreement to cooperate on vaccine production. And that is, in a sense, the proof of concept of how the Quad can function in the region, in the sense that India gets in its production prowess, large-scale production prowess. Japan and America pitch in their monetary resources, and Australia comes in with their logistical expertise. I think the Quad has wasted a lot of time being gung-ho over the form of the Quad and not the function of the Quad. However, this initiative on vaccines is much belated and much welcome. And if this does indeed serve as a proof of concept of the efficacy of Quad to provide an alternate vision path for countries, particularly maybe ASEAN countries in the region, the next logical step would be to do a similar collaborative effort in the tech space, particularly in the telco space, because there is a need for viable options if the US is going to pressure regional countries not to go for Chinese propositions under Huawei or go for other telco equipment like the ZTE Corp equipment. There has to be viable options, and in that case, Quad could step in if, once again, condition on the possibility that the vaccine cooperation serves as a good proof of concept. And then again, Japanese and American funding could be integral. India could come in with its production, large-scale production prowess. Australia can come in with its logistical expertise on laying of undersea cables. And remember, India Jio is the only Indian telco to be certified as a clean network under the Trump administration's Clean Network Initiative. So there is much scope for the Quad to also enter the tech space and collaborate and offer a viable alternative to the region.
Okay, wonderful. So not only strategic, but telecommunication and economic cooperation would be something you look forward to. In fact, in that context, I think you agreed with what Captain Parmar said, that the Quad Plus, that is Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand, would probably be the future into getting more and more ASEAN countries into the entire space of.
And I think more importantly, particularly in case of India, New Delhi, there is a recognition that it does not want to put all its eggs in one basket. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the US's support is integral to India's rise in the Indian Ocean to become a security provider here in the Indian Ocean. But let's also not forget the US's strategy to see India's rise in the Indian Ocean is towards its own interest of not being bogged down or being caught up in the Indian Ocean, and it can focus all its naval assets and resources in the Western Pacific instead. So if India takes care of the Indian Ocean, it frees up US resources to be focused in the Western Pacific. And I think there is cognizance of that in New Delhi, and one of the ways in which it has sort of manifested in itself is that India chose to conduct joint patrols with France and not the US, despite many US commandos over the past 10 years wanting to do that with us. And why did we choose France? Because France has overseas territories in the Indian Ocean. So for France, much like India, the Indian Ocean region is a matter of sovereignty and not strategy like the US. So France has real skin in the game, and India has therefore recognized France as a viable partner to do joint patrols here in the Indian Ocean. And I think that's a sound strategy.
Well, that's interesting. And well, the US assets in the Middle East would definitely also keep the US with some skin in the game, in terms of as long as there's dependency on oil. Well, so I'm informed by the organizers that we have hit 1.5 hours of this fantastic panel, and that's a time limit. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop speaking, and there've been a lot of questions on the chat box. What I would like all the panelists to do, and in no order of preference, as you would like to go, pick up any question from the chat, respond to it, please, and also you can give your closing comments. Would that be okay for everyone? Yep. I know Captain Parmar wanted to respond to Kashish on something, so you can start, Captain Parmar, if that's fine.
Thank you so much. I'd like to add on, we have this Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which we are exporting, if I can use the word. There are 7 pillars. India decided to take the lead on maritime security and disaster risk reduction management. Japan has said it will take trade and connectivity. Australia has come on board with marine ecology, and now France has come on board with marine resources. So in a way, you've got 3 nations of the Quad already pushing some sort of an understanding insofar as Indo-Pacific goes. So I don't know if the US would like to come on board on this issue. And this is something that we can push out forward. And this forms a consensus when you look at it, along with the southbound policies, both of Taiwan and South Korea and a number of other nations. So what I'm saying is the fundamental, the denominators are already there. You just need to stitch them together. And all these are benign activities. They are meant to enhance the economy and stability and security of the region. So there is already enough steps taking place, but we need to get more people on board, or more nations on board, like-minded nations is what I had said. So I just thought I'll air this sort of a view that we need to look at it. And that's one way in which we can get the middle powers on board, as Kashish said. And of course, there is that phrase which is called middle power quad. So perhaps, as I said, it's, to my mind, it's an idea whose time will come, but we need to be at it. Insofar as the questions are concerned, I have one question which Yogesh Athavale has asked me is about the outstanding Sir Creek boundary dispute and contingent demarcation. For any international arbitration, first of all, I think it's important to understand that, do the nations want a solution? Is there going to be an amicable solution coming out? You need to be on the same page. And that is the reason why India-Bangladesh arbitration, or even Bangladesh-Myanmar arbitration, has come through. And therefore, we see the Bay of Bengal as, to my mind, a good example of a stable and secure sub-region in the Indo-Pacific compared to many other sub-regions. Insofar as Pakistan is concerned, I don't think an arbitration is going to help, because first of all, the border is under dispute. And I don't think Pakistan would like the border to be settled and in any manner which is not in their favor, and likewise India. That is also the simple reason why China has decided to keep the border live. So we have a very active western border, and now we have a very lively turning to active northern and eastern border. So these are not issues that you can actually take to arbitration, because there is phenomenal differences in opinion. And you can only tackle these issues once you decide that, all right, we will go for an amicable resolution. But having seen the history of animosity between our two neighbors in India, I don't think it will be a good idea to go into arbitration with any of them, for that matter. So I'll pause here. Thank you.
Okay, maybe the next panelist can proceed. Also, a couple of interesting points came up on the chat is about a post-Brexit and a post-COVID world. So maybe in your concluding remarks, you could put some comments in the changing dynamics post-Brexit and post-COVID.
Can I say respond to a question? Yes, there was a very interesting question which actually goes to the core theme of this panel itself on UNCLOS, and should India be getting into a situation as a member of the Quad, or I would say even as an independent country without the Quad coming into it, for UNCLOS, the next phase, UNCLOS 4, a renegotiation. My short response to that would be, we should be careful what we wish for. The longer response would be that UNCLOS itself, as somebody else said also, needs to find more support, more ratification, and more adherence to what exists today. What I feel is, if China already has been pushing for a new regime of international law, including newer thinking in international maritime law, and to go down that road would be quite a risky road. I would say that it is perhaps not even necessary right now, because the current UNCLOS provides enough correctness, I would say, and from what Ms. Bhatt was mentioning, I think I would probably differ with Sarabjeet Parmar here to say that henceforth we should also correctly call it a civilized agreement and a ladies and gentlemen's agreement rather than merely a gentleman's agreement, because UNCLOS really does provide a good platform. It stands well as it is now. Some of the creases need to be ironed out, but they will never be ironed out, because individual interests will dominate, and that's how it is. If we open up UNCLOS again, then the matters of international waters, matters of sovereignty, matters of islands, baselines, archipelagic states, or archipelagic claims by essentially continental states, all will again come back, and we will probably never be able to have an UNCLOS 4 which has had the degree of support that UNCLOS 3 had, which was indeed a great improvement on the first and the second conferences of the laws of the sea. I would say, again, we should be careful what we wish for. And I don't think we should wish for renegotiating the convention once again. It's quite okay right now.
Shall I go next? Okay. So I have already answered the question I had in the panel, but the very interesting point that I would wanted to raise, and you brought out about post-COVID was structured and how Indo-Pacific will react to it. It's quite interesting fascinating to see that during the COVID times, maritime routes were the most exploited ones for the issues of piracy, drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms trafficking. And over the last 1.5 years, we have seen tremendous increase in maritime routes for these piracy issues. So when the countries were looking inside, handling the pandemic, these maritime routes become more and more vulnerable. And that is the reason during COVID and post-COVID, Indo-Pacific has to build up more resilient maritime security structures and sea lane of communication, because this is what in the end matters. We have been talking about wars and US-China rivalry and everything else over here. But in the end, what we are missing is these crucial points that how these maritime routes have been exploited, and we are not looking at it. Another issue is increasing maritime and territorial claims that China has been doing, and everyone has discussed about it. When the countries were looking inwards, China did use that opportunity, did not leave even a single day, wasted a single day in increasing its maritime presence, making its territorial claims, carrying out all the kind of activities, maritime activities, military activities in both gray zone and as well as in a military manner. So I think post-COVID world, we'll have these increased tensions coming up, which within Indo-Pacific we need to start focusing right now, start working on right now in terms of how to make these sea lanes of communications more resilient, more resilient regional structures. I think this is something we need to focus in international and maritime law in the Indo-Pacific. It's very crucial we start right now before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja.
I'm okay with going now, and maybe let's have Professor Kraska the final word, since he's our special guest today. So I'm just going to take one question. There was a question on LAMOA, which was the interoperability agreement we signed with the US in the final months of the Obama administration. The question about its implications. Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-India-US partnership. In fact, that is my primary research interest. So that is my bread and butter. So why would I betray that? But my only point here is that let's be cognizant of the positives and negatives of aligning with the US. And in case of interoperability agreements like the LAMOA, it's positives and positives all the way. And one of the key examples of that, of course, is when India was clashing with China in the Himalayas last year, the Trump administration used the LAMOA. India invoked the LAMOA for the first time to seek winter equipment for its soldiers in the Himalayas so that they could stand and face the Chinese troops in the Himalayas. So there is a lot of upside to partner with the US. US support is critical towards India's naval efforts as well. If you, for instance, consider that India has now established the Information Fusion Center in Gurgaon for maritime domain awareness. US-made P-8 Poseidon aircrafts form the backbone of IFC IOR's activities. So US material support is very important, but at the same time, on certain convergences and certain long-standing divergences, there are issues in the US-India partnership. And I'll quickly end with citing just one such divergence. The US belatedly aligned its idea of the Indo-Pacific in line with India's at, I think, the Raisina dialogue last year. And it was much belated because the US did not recognize the importance of the Northwest Indian Ocean region and the East Africa coast. India lays a lot of importance on that region, and it wants that region to also be seen as a part of the Indo-Pacific region. The US has now, of course, aligned its conception with India. But my point is that it was much belated. Instead, partners like France have had no a difference on aspects such as this one. And this has led to a quick mobilization of middle powers. And an example of that is France, Australia, and India. They have joined hands to form the Paris, New Delhi, Canberra axis. They have quickly signed interoperability agreements between them, which could then become the primary force for the good of the Indian Ocean region, because let's remember, all three countries have territories here. The Australians have Cocos Island. We, of course, are an Indian Ocean region nation. We have Andaman Nicobar Islands as well, and the French have the La Réunion Islands. So that sort of covers all the corners of the Indian Ocean. And if there is greater maritime cooperation and activity between these three powers, the Indian Ocean region can truly be secure by middle powers alone. So I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just say a few final words. I appreciate all the comments from everybody. It's a real honor to be able to talk with you today. I guess fundamentally my view would be that China poses the greatest risk to a stable legal world order, and that all states, including the United States, have a struggle on how to manage their relationships with China. I'll give you one perfect example that I can end with, and that is that the recent announcement by the United States that it conducted a freedom of navigation operation in India's EEZ. We did the same thing to Japan 2 weeks earlier. Now, this was a great departure from the long history of freedom of navigation, because it has never been announced after the fact in order to poke some country in the face. We don't even announce it for states that are potential adversaries, such as Iran. So why did we do it? Well, I don't know, but my suspicion is that we did it in order to be able to tell China that we're not treating China any differently, to assure China, to placate China. And this is what all of our countries have done on everything. We've done it on the coronavirus, we've done it on trade. And so the United States has, in recent years, gotten really tough on Russia. And that's probably a good thing for some of the malign behavior that Russia has done, invading Ukraine, cyber attacks that are relentless in the West. And that's fine, enforcing sanctions against Russia, which has really impeded its economy. So my view is that the United States and all the other countries have to think seriously about what sort of order they want in the world, and whether and to what extent that they want to accommodate a China that has had exceptional treatment. And my view is that that treatment should stop, and that we ought to deal with China on its own terms, just as we have with the Russian Federation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Rear Admiral Shrikhande, Captain Parmar, Professor Kraska, Ms. Bhatt, and Mr. Parpiani. Thank you so much for this fantastic discussion. This is the third day of the SPIL seminar. And just before I came to this panel discussion, I was judging a very interesting competition. It is called a Judgment Deliberation Competition, where students from 13 colleges took part. They were given a problem, and they were actually given what the petitioner said and what the respondent said. And it was a problem of a ship arrest. It's a maritime problem. And they had to write a judgment saying on the 6 issues they had to decide. So that event just got over before this panel. And if the panelists can stay for another 7 to 10 minutes, where we are having a valedictory and where we will be announcing the winners of this competition, I think they would feel wonderful. So if you can do that, it'll be super. And I'll just hand it over to the organizers to take it from here. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Alessandra?
Yes, we'll just have Yash and Khushi back on for a minute.
Oh. We would like to thank our esteemed panelists for this incredibly informative and engrossing panel discussion. Rear Admiral Shrikhande, Captain Parmar, Professor Kraska, Professor Bhatt, Mr. Parpiani, and our moderator for the day, Professor Daswani. We cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your busy schedules to share your knowledge and expertise amongst students eager to learn. It's safe to say it's been an enthralling discussion, and we have all learned a lot. We're also honored to have the presence of Commodore Shrikant Kesnur. Commodore has guided and supported us since the inception of the panel discussion, and we could not be more grateful for his contribution. Thank you, sir.
I would now like to call upon Ms. Niyati Karya, the Editor-in-Chief, who will be unveiling the revival edition of the International Law Journal.
Good evening to everyone present here today. Over the last year, we at SPIL decided to take up the initiative of reviving the International Law Journal at Government Law College. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Honorable Justice G.S. Patel of the Bombay High Court for his support and contributing in the form of a foreword for the journal. I would like to thank our principal, Dr. Asmita Vaidya, for her encouragement and constant support, and of course, our professor in charge, Professor Vismeshroff, and Professor Daswani for mentoring us. We hope to take the journal forward year after year and make it bigger and better. Without any further ado, I'm very happy and extremely proud to unveil the first volume of the International Law Journal. I would like to extend my gratitude to Professor Anita Singh, Mr. Sudhir Verma, and Professor Rabia Shams for taking out their valuable time for being a part of the review process. And last, but definitely not the least, I would like to thank the entire editorial board. As the editor-in-chief, I am extremely appreciative of all of you for conducting such thorough reviews and editing the submissions that we received to make the journal that we have today. I would also like to convey my special thanks to Alessandra, Isha, and Sachi for designing the entire journal from scratch. The journal is available on the SPIL website now. And now I'd like to share certain snippets, starting with Justice G.S. Patel's foreword. The following are the articles that have been published in the first volume. And here are some snippets from their articles. We are now honored to invite our beloved Professor Daswani to begin the valedictory ceremony for the 11th International Law Summit 2021.
I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. I thought you students were handling this. Geez, everybody just close their ears. The students just deflected this tough task to me.
I have sent the results on the Zoom chat.
Ah, you've sent the results on this. Oh, right. Okay. So I'm supposed to announce the results, right?
Yes, so my apologies.
Ah, it's okay, no problem. You guys must be tired doing such human work. Okay, so The results for the judgment deliberation competition, I will start from the bottom. The second best judgment goes to Ganesh Murali and Sonam Pandey of the D.Y. Patil University School of Law. A round of applause for them. The second best judgment for Ganesh Murali and Sonam Pandey. The best written judgment is to the Symbiosis Law School, Pune, Jay Joshi and R.S. Sanjana. Can we put on your cameras if you're here, Jay Joshi and R.S. Sanjana, so we can see you? Just you can wave to everybody so we can acknowledge your achievements. Thank you. The runner-up team in the judgment deliberation competition, this is the oral rounds. The runners-up team is Government Law College, Drishti Israni and Malika Iyer. Can you please put on your cameras? A round of applause for Drishti and Malika. And the winning team is KES Law College, that's Devika Kaku and Hetvi Dharod. The winning team, KES Law College, Devika Kaku and Hetvi Dharod. Devika and Hetvi, would you just like to say something, just like 30 seconds? I know it's not fair for me to spring this on you at such short notice, but if you'd just like to say something, we'll really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, sir, for this opportunity. This has been a huge exposure for me and my beloved teammate. And I would like to appreciate the efforts, the prompt and efficient efforts taken by the SPIL committee as well as the GLC College in organizing such a successful event at this platform. I would also make special mention of Sushmita, the SPIL coordinator, who actually convinced me into participating in this competition. And it was pretty random because she was coordinating with me for registrations from the college. And then she said, Devika, why don't you participate? And that is how the idea came into being. And from there, talking to Sushmita in March, and I see myself here on 1st of May winning the competition. This is a very huge thing for me. So I would like to thank the organizers, and I would like to appreciate each one of them, the CCs, all the SPIL members, for putting up all the efforts, because I know the amount of dedication it takes in organizing such a huge event. So thank you so much. It was a beautiful event, and that's all.
Thank you so much. All the best to you. Bye. Alexandra?
On behalf of SPIL Mumbai, I would like to heartily congratulate the winners of the Judgment Deliberation Competition 2021. This year's summit would not have been possible without the participants' enthusiasm and sheer perseverance, even through these unfathomably difficult times. Words cannot express how much we value and cherish everyone's contribution at the summit. I would like to begin this vote of thanks by sincerely thanking all our esteemed panelists, Rear Admiral Sudarshan Shrikhande, Captain Sarabjeet Parmar, Professor James Kraska, Ms. Pooja Bhatt, Mr. Kashish Parpiani, and our moderator, Professor Kishu Daswani, for a truly insightful and meaningful discussion and sparing their valuable time to join us today. We would also like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Commodore Srikanth and Captain Himadri Das for systematically guiding us through the formation of this magnificent panel discussion. We would like to extend our deep gratitude to Honorable Justice G.S. Patel of the Bombay High Court for writing the foreword for the International Law Journal and for his inaugural message for the JDC participants. Further, I must express our appreciation to all the judges of the Judgment Deliberation Competition, especially Ms. Sindhura Polepalli, who also drafted our competition module this year. I take this opportunity to thank our respected principal of the Government Law College, Mumbai, Dr. Srimati Asmita Vaidya, for her unwavering faith in the committee and its pursuits, our professor in charge, Professor Vismay Shroff, and our mentor, Professor Kishu Daswani, for their guidance, encouragement, and inputs at all times and hours. A big thank you to our knowledge partners in Forma Law UK and Knowledge Trust. I am extremely grateful to my predecessors at SPIL, Ms. Shrutika Barabde, Ms. Harshita Jawar, Mr. Kushan Kode, and Mr. Prateek Saini for their assistance and support through the course of this academic year. Lastly, but most definitely not the least, I would like to thank my precious senior and junior core of SPIL, Ms. Ashwini Chavan and Ms. Niyati Karya, the Vice Presidents of SPIL, Mr. Samihan Vinchurkar, the Treasurer of SPIL, and the Junior Core, Isha Palas, Khushi Khandelwal, Maitri Parsana, Neha Guge, Osho Dubey, Sachi Ray, Sushmita Pandey, and Yashla Azawala. Organizing the first online International Law Summit was a mammoth task and initially looked almost impossible. But there is a quote that says, "Tough times don't last, tough teams do." We look forward to your support and participation for our future events. Thank you. This marks the end of the International Law Summit, and you are free to exit the meeting, the attendees.
Kishu, thank you again. It's a lot of fun and a real honor always to engage with you and GLC.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming, really. I mean, when I first asked you and I told the students to contact you, I was thinking, you know, will the time really match up? Because sometimes we have this program at 3 in the afternoon. That would be really early for you, but then it was at 6. I think it worked out fine. That was, how have you been? You've been good?
Everything is doing well, and I'm always delighted to join you. And hopefully after this pandemic subsides, my heart goes out to India. I hope that the US and other countries can do everything possible. We're all in this together. And then once it subsides, we can resume our in-person engagements.
Yes, definitely. Well, we're going through a tough time now, but hope